Welcome back to PLS 510. Today we're going to start on what will be probably 3 units on forages for horses. This unit will be the forage considerations for horse pasture. To review something that we might have said earlier on in the semester, we have about 242,000 horses in Kentucky across 35,000 farms. These horse farms utilize about 1.1 million acres and produce about $1.1 billion in revenue. Thoroughbreds are important and are, in fact, the most dominant breed, closely followed by quarter horses and walking horses. But as you can see, we have several different types of or different breeds of horses in Kentucky. If you look at the uses of those horses, the dominant use for horses will be trail riding and pleasure. Brood mares come in second, and then other types of horses from there. In order to put horses in context, I'm going to compare a little bit about the digestive systems of ruminants versus horses, and I think you will connect that then to the decisions that we will make or the things that need to happen for equine species. In general, you can look at this picture and see that the rumen and the GI tract and the capacity in the cow is much greater than the capacity in the horse. In the ruminant, fiber digestion occurs in the rumen. Energy from fiber digestion is absorbed as volatile fatty acids through the rumen wall. Fiber digestion is in the foregut, and therefore the microbes that digest the forage, those that are growing in the rumen, will have nutrients that are harvested in the ruminant because they will leave the rumen and go then into the rest of the GI tract, which would include something like a true stomach, then the small intestine, large intestine. And for that reason, the protein requirements with ruminants typically are lower than for equine species because of this beneficial microbial protein that is flowing down into the GI tract in the ruminant. In the ruminant, we will typically have, it's not only okay to have 2 or 3 large meals, that's what they prefer to have. They prefer to go out and then eat a large meal and go back and lay down and then begin to ruminate, where that's where the rumen will begin to mix the forage with the rumen contents, and then will eructate or burp up a bolus that will be chewed then by the ruminant and go back down into the rumen for further digestion. In the horse, as in the ruminant, we do have microbial fiber digestion, but in this case it occurs in the cecum and the colon, which is the last part of the GI tract. Energy in the horse from fiber is absorbed as the volatile fatty acids, just as with the ruminant, but in contrast to the ruminant, the microbial nutrients, in particular, the microbial protein is lost because it will then be excreted from the colon, and it does not get digested as it does in the ruminant. And with the horse, because of the smaller GI tract and the smaller stomach, they are designed to have several small meals during the day rather than 2 or 3 large ones. So as we begin to focus on the forage considerations for horse pasture, I want to remind you that even though we have horse pastures on our large thoroughbred farms that look pristine and surely they can't have problems, in fact, pasture problems are common to all horse farms. So if you want to take a second, and I will let you do this, think about the most common pasture problems that you know of or can think of across all horse farms. So pause the lecture, and if you want to go ahead and mark down or write down a few of these. Here are my top 5, if you will, most common pasture problems in horse farms. Number 1 is weeds, and number 2 is related to it, poor stands of grass. Number 3, toxic forages, and in particular, the indified infected tall fescue. Number 4 is the overstocking that is present, especially on small farms. And number 5 is related to that, not having any pasture rotation or rest. Horses are notoriously hard on pasture. They graze closely and they repeatedly graze those spots and wind up severely affecting the forage composition in a pasture, such as the pasture to the left at our Spindletop Research Farm that has been absolutely taken over by broadleaf plantain. And horses are a little unique in that they choose to run and move through the pasture pretty aggressively, and they can lead to some hoof damage as well. So they're hard on pastures. This probably is the worst example of horses being hard on pasture, and this is the result in a boarding operation that was overstocked of severe repeated overgrazing. What you see in the lower closely grazed areas is some hanging on, barely living, barely vigorous, barely above ground, bluegrass and white clover, and a little bit of tall fescue. And in the other areas, ragweed has just exploded. So quite obviously, these pastures have had some poor management and are in bad need of a mowing at the very least. But you can see that this is the extreme result of repeated overgrazing without some sort of repairing management on those pastures. Would like to make a few points about barns and horse pastures, in particular about barns on breeding operations, where the broodmares are rotated through pastures and the barns are based on stage of gestation. This limits our options for rotational grazing and forage reseeding, in that we really cannot take a whole field out of production if that field is where the mares need to be just prior to foaling or just after foaling. So folds or fields around the foaling barns especially have to be free of toxic tall fescue, and we've been quite successful in using some management to do this. And one thing I need to mention here, and I'll mention in the weeds lecture as well, one particular method that is very useful in taking toxic tall fescue out of bluegrass and orchard grass is the use of plateau herbicide. Plateau will selectively kill tall fescue in orchard grass and bluegrass, and having a grass taken out of a grass by a herbicide is a rare opportunity. So I'd like you to remember that plateau herbicide is a way to take fescue out of orchard grass and bluegrass, and we will talk about that some more at different times. We need to have pasture management goals in our horse situations, and of course we want persistence, we want vigorous pasture, we want to utilize the pasture that we grow well, we don't want to just grow it to mow it down. We want it to be thick, and by thick we mean hopefully that it will help us to then inhibit or prevent the germination and emergence of weeds. And we would like it to supply as much nutrition and as much quantity through the year as we can, so that we don't have to supply as much in the way of supplement. Unique to horse pastures too, as we stated a little bit before, is the need for the forages to provide support for exercise. So an ideal horse pasture will be nutritious. It'll have minimal anti-quality effects, and usually the one we think of first is that toxic indified of tall fescue. We'd like the forage to grow as long as possible, to have a thick stand, to be resilient and stress tolerant. We don't want a small drought or a period of hot weather then to cause us to lose a forage stand. And as we said before, we want the forage to provide hoof support. And of course, aesthetics matters, and forage crops help the horse farm to have a very positive aesthetical characteristic. If you want to talk about species for horse pastures, we have many, many options, but some are better than others, and the best tolerate frequent close grazing. And those two for Kentucky are bluegrass primarily, and in a growing number of cases, Bermuda grass. And of course, some forages have anti-quality factors. We've talked about the clovers and slavers, particularly red clover. And of course, you will remember that that's due to the presence of the Rhizoctonia or black patch fungus. And the toxic principle there is slaframine. And the anti-quality factor we do think of as the most is tall fescue and the endophyte effects on pregnant mares. I'd like to talk about clover just for a moment. Clover is a staple in our horse pastures. It's present in most or many horse pasture mixes that you might buy at an ag supply store. But horse clover in horse pastures has a mixed blessing. We certainly like the nutrition that it gives. We like the fact that it will tend to have a longer growing season and grow a little bit more into the summer than some of our cool season grasses. But clover can also then hide the fact that we don't have a good stand of grass. And because the horses can graze close, and they will graze bluegrass to the ground, or timothy in particular, or orchard grass, then we can have a white clover stand that can come in and fill in all those bare places. And I want to show you this picture taken from the greenhouse to remind you that white clover can be very aggressive. You can see how that there is no room down on the lower part of this sward of white clover or any grass at all to be there. And of course, white clover provides very little hoof support, particularly into the winter. So pasture is important but complicated in that both composition and availability are dynamic. Of course, pastures are dominated by our cool season forages, and we have the typical peak of production in the first half of the year, followed by slower production in the hotter and drier periods of the time, and then tailing off as we get cold. And as a result, pasture availability is inconsistent. And this is the same type of graph overlaid against the seasons, late winter, early spring, late spring. We have a period of low productivity in the summer, and again after we go into the cold weather of the winter. And of course, I'd like to remind you, pastures are not monocultures. And we have a lot of data from the UK Equine Pasture Evaluation Program that help us understand what is present on horse farms. This is the species percentage composition across from 2005 to 2017, corrected for weeds and bare soil across horse farms in Kentucky. And you can see the dominant grass is bluegrass, followed by fescue, then orchard grass and white clover. But these are the averages. We know that the variation is quite large. For this 40% average bluegrass, we had 70% in some pastures and none in others. The fescue ranged from as much as 45% down to 0, and orchard grass could be very high, 89%, or down as low as 2. And quite obviously, we had more fields closer to 2 than closer to 89 to come up with a mean of 17. And white clover, you saw the same kind of distribution. Some fields had an extremely high level of white clover and others very little. We did, of course, find tall fescue on horse farms, and that fescue on the horse farms was on average infected with the endophyte 74% of the time. Sometimes it was low, and many times it was very high. And you can tell by how close this average is, this mean is, to our top number of 97, that more pastures were near 97 than percent infected than here in the 16 range. Forages, of course, are important sources of nutrients for all categories of horses, but in particular, they're an economical source of nutrients on central Kentucky breeding farms. Forages provide nutrients in the way of calories and protein, major minerals, they're not quite as good, or they're kind of a mixed message in terms of how well they supply trace minerals, and they're a good source of vitamins as well. We want to present to you some pasture composition data collected by Roger Allman from the Farm Clinic across Central Kentucky breeding farms. These data are monthly samples of fescue, bluegrass, and orchard grass and clover when it was present for 2000 to 2004. This is the range, or annual range, of percent crude protein in pasture grass from January through December. And we'll look at several graphs just like this, 4 of them in a row. In fact, we've got the month at the bottom, and the percent is the vertical axis. And you can see that we will have, in general, quite high concentrations of protein content in our pasture grasses, even during the lowest part of the summer, and in the lush green growth in the spring, and the fresh growth in the fall. You can see we can have some very, very high levels of crude protein. You compare that to alfalfa hay and timothy hay, many times in many months, the protein content in our pasture grasses exceeds that of the hays that we will be feeding. The other major component of nutrition that's in our pastures is the digestible energy in megacalories per pound of dry matter. You see a similar trend in that we have a peak in the spring and a period of lower energy in the midsummer. And then as we go into the fall and winter, we rise back up. If you do that again, the same exercise with some of our supplements, you can see the range of digestible energy in our concentrates. Actually, most of the time is greater than our pasture, except for that peak month of April. And most of the time, our pasture energy will be superior to that present in the majority of the hays that we might feed. And I'll just use one mineral, for example, the percent calcium in pasture grasses compared to the approximate requirement. And you can see that pastures are, in general, at least a fair source of calcium as well. As we switch gears from thinking of pasture as a nutritional source to thinking about how do we manage pastures so that they are healthy, I want to point you to this publication, and it is not a numbered publication, but it is, you can find it by Googling Improving Kentucky Horse Pastures and adding UKY to the end of that, and this will come up. It's a PDF. It is included in your readings for this week. So in turn, we'll walk through a few of these agronomic recommendations. Number one is to manage the seasonal production of those cool season grasses. And of course, we've got the seasonal growth curve that we have to deal with. The peak of production in the spring, which is usually in far excess of what we need. Then we have a period of very slow growth or low growth in midsummer. And then hopefully when we have rain and mild temperatures, we have a rebound of our pasture production. And we manage this in a lot of ways, but in the summertime with low pasture productivity, and in the wintertime where we have no productivity, then we need to either add acres in the summer, in the case of the summer, add some new acres so that we're not overgrazing this part of the pasture, or feed hay and supplement. But in general, one of the things that we must do when we use horses on pasture in Kentucky is to deal with, or have a plan to deal with, this seasonality of production that does not match our needs of the horse. We need to soil test every 2 to 3 years, and this is a review, depth down to 3 or 4 inches, and apply the limestone and P&K that is necessary. We are fortunate in Central Kentucky in particular, and across Kentucky in general, in that our soils are fairly fertile. And in particular, near here in Central Kentucky, we often need no phosphorus and little limestone. And remember that nutrient removal from pastures is low, but when we are making hay, that we're removing about 36 pounds of N, 13 pounds of P2O5, and 54 pounds of K2O per ton of hay, and we should fertilize accordingly. Nitrogen is one of the biggest and strongest tools for us to rejuvenate grass and to manage grass on horse pastures. But nitrogen fertilization of grasses can be very different for horses versus cattle. And what I'm about to show you comes from AGR 200, the soil sampling and nutrient management in horse pastures. And I'm only going to show a small part of this publication. And I would recommend that you get this publication if you're interested in nutrient management, fertilizer nutrient management for horses. For example, this is the major way that nitrogen fertilization is different with horses. It may be more important to apply nitrogen in late fall to support more tillering in perennial grasses when it's too late for that same nitrogen fertilization to increase pasture yield. Let's look at these nitrogen fertilization strategies in a little more detail. This is nitrogen fertilization when we have low stocking rates. In other words, more than 2 acres per horse. So we would then apply nitrogen in August, September, and October, November at moderate amounts, again, to stimulate tillering of the cool season grasses. The reason why we would apply nitrogen here, which gives us less yield, is that we don't necessarily need to produce more yield because we're already getting an excess of yield in the spring. So then we would defer our fertilization until the fall. This is a nitrogen fertilization strategy for high stocking rates. In other words, this nitrogen fertilization strategy is for high stocking rates when we have less than 2 acres per horse. And you'll notice right away that our fertilization is not in the late summer and early fall, but it then is in the very early spring, February, March, and then in May, and then in August. And we will, in general, use a little bit higher level of nitrogen here in the spring and take advantage of this boost in production. And we will also fertilize then in May and August to then extend this production out into summer if we are given rainfall. So this is a growth-driven strategy as opposed to a tillering-driven strategy when we have low stocking rates. Another agronomic consideration is to control weeds that limit pasture productivity. I really love this publication, AGR 207. The front page is the pictures of the weeds, broadleaf weeds of Kentucky pastures, and on the back is a table that shows herbicide efficacy for several different weeds and the proper time then to treat for those particular weeds. And it also shows the effectiveness of mowing as a management strategy on these weeds. I want to, in particular, remind you that fall can be a very beneficial time to control many of our pasture weeds, as can early spring. But in this case, you can see a field of cool season grasses dominated by dandelion and purple dead nettle, which are opportunistic weeds coming in when grasses are thinning out. But right down the middle of the field, on the left, we applied 2,4-D in early fall. On the right, no herbicide at all. And you can see that this is an early spring photograph, and we have completely inhibited the purple dead nettle, at least to a large degree, and completely inhibited the dandelion, the yellow flower product. So we have eliminated those competitive weeds in these grass pastures and done so with fall broadleaf herbicides. Like with cattle, we want to use good grazing management and rotate pastures where we can, leaving 3 to 4 inches of residual growth. And we can use temporary electric fencing Cattle, I should say horses, will respond very well to it, but some farms just choose not to use the electric fence for many reasons, and that's perfectly okay. But we can use that then to rotate pastures. And this picture again that I've shown you before is a reminder that we want to use sustainable stocking rates, use mowing and other sorts of management tools to keep down our undesirable weeds. We, of course, need to manage toxic tall fescue, removing pregnant mares for the last trimester of gestation, or at least the last 60 days, and preferably longer. We'd ideally like to test fields for the presence of the endophyte and production of the toxic alkaloid ergovaline, and remember some of those symptoms that toxic tall fescue does cause our pregnant mares, such as prolonged gestation, a thickened placenta or red bag, agalactia or lack of milk, dystocia, which is foaling difficulty, and fair foal and mare mortality. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we can use herbicides, in particular plateau herbicide, to selectively take tall fescue out of orchard grass, bluegrass pastures. We can overseed thin stands, most often with a no-till drill, such as up in the upper left-hand corner. Now, winter paddocks, such as this one on a small horse farm in Mercer County, can be very challenging in that the horse numbers may be high, and the chance for pastures, or in this case the paddock grasses, to get a hold and to have a chance of withstanding hoof traffic can be quite low, particularly in winters where we have excessive rainfall. On this particular farm, you could install a heavy use pad to try to have a place to eliminate mud formation where the animals tend to congregate. Or as we did with this farm, we overseeded annually in the fall with perennial and annual ryegrass, which gave a good and quick cover on these paddocks going into the winter. And we may, again, poke it up and create some mud in the wintertime, but we at least have a chance of having some grass cover to help prevent that in more moderate and less rainy winter times. There is a publication that UK has, ID 164, high traffic area pads for horses that may be quite useful to you. And we may want to reestablish poor stands of grass completely, or certainly reestablish toxic fescue pastures, in particular those fields that have toxic fescue where we need to keep pregnant mares. And we can use orchard grass, Kentucky bluegrass, and orchard grass and bluegrass are the predominant choices when seeding these areas. We can have them with or without perennial ryegrass. If you go to major ag suppliers and look for a horse pasture mix that they have already made, it's going to usually have orchard grass as the dominant grass, some Kentucky bluegrass, and perennial or annual ryegrass, probably perennial ryegrass, which will give a very quick cover. We can use novel tall fescue on these situations where we have killed out all of the previous vegetation, such as that picture on the left, but we must carefully kill all of the old tall fescue, because obviously you will not be able to tell the difference between the new tall fescue, the novel tall fescue that you plant, and the old toxic tall fescue. And of course, white clover may form a mix or part of a mix for replanting horse pastures. When we replant or drill these horse pastures, it is advantageous to drill in two different directions so that we have more chance and quicker cover, more chance for quicker cover in these settings with our bunch grasses. And this happens to be a tall fescue seeding, but an orchard grass seeding would look similar. Bluegrass is included in most of our horse pasture mixes because of its ability to form a sod. So in summary, forages for horse pasture, Equine are fiber digesters, but they do so in the hindgut, which is unlike cattle. Horses do not benefit from microbial protein from the cecum like cattle, and so therefore they have a higher protein requirement than cattle. Horses graze closer and will repeatedly graze the same spots, and which is quite damaging to horse pasture. Pasture goals are similar with horses than with other livestock, but may prioritize exercise and hoof support. And stocking rates and overgrazing, or high stocking rates or overgrazing, is one of the biggest problems on most farms. Thank you very much.